Back in 1932, the Australians declared war on the Emus, and 1 month later they surrendered, leaving the Emus victorious. This is the extent of the story that a majority of people know. However, after this war, the Emus were different. They had gained not only a hatred for humans, but an understanding of violence. They had also gained a love for marmalade, so take that as you will. Anyways, they spent the next century studying the humans, preparing for their time. They became killing machines. And the worst part is that as the years went on, they no longer hated the humans, but at this point they had gained the love of death and destruction, gaining a sick satisfaction from carrying it out. They even eventually decided that they loved pineapple on pizza, showing that they were truly evil creatures. But finally, after years of studying and practice, on December 6th of 2025, the Australians were attacked by the Emus. You could argue it was a war, but it was more of a slaughter. Within a week, the country fell to the Emus. As the news of this reached the rest of the world, the panic began. Countries enacted martial law, drafts started, armies formed overnight. That one neighbor you have, with the bunker and all of that beef jerky, began rubbing it in everyone's faces that they were right about the end of the world all along. Some countries, of course, took advantage of this chaos, like Greenland, who took over Denmark, and Florida, which took over Japan. But while this was going on, the Emus ran into a problem. The ocean. You see, the ocean is rather hard to cross without boats, and the Emus had gotten carried away in their conquest of Australia and destroyed virtually everything, including the docks and boats. So naturally, this left one reasonable option, which was befriend dolphins and have them carry the Emus across the ocean to Indonesia. This is where the Emus began their island hopping campaign. Over a period of 5 weeks, they went from island to island, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Nothing was able to stand in their way, and as the rest of the world watched, they studied, trying to determine the best way to combat these Emus. Trench warfare was useless as the Emus could jump barbed wire easily and were skilled at clearing trenches. Planes had the least casualties on the human side, but were extremely ineffective at killing the birds. Planes was also a mediocre movie. I mean, it wasn't that it was bad, it didn't have the same spirit as Cars had. I mean, if Planes was first, maybe it would have been seen as better, but no, you're right. Concept after concept was tried and failed, until finally, they found something that worked. Tanks. You see, tanks had been deemed ineffective in most modern warfare due to the average infantry soldier being able to take it out with one of the various missile launchers. Emus don't have missile launchers. Yet. The tanks provided adequate armor against the emus' beaks and claws, the guns were able to cleanly take out emus, minimal casualties, maximum damage. However, because a majority of countries had stopped developing new tanks decades ago, Russia was virtually one of the only countries who was still producing tanks. Even if they had been severely weakened by the Ukrainian war, they still had the means of production set up to mass-produce tanks. But, Russia being Russia, decided to focus on defending themselves, leaving the rest of the world to scramble to put together tanks. And put together tanks they did. The Americans developed the Henry II tank, which was a state-of-the-art vehicle with detachable drones for scouting, a manual turret alongside an automatic turret on top which would identify and shoot emus. And honestly, it cost a ridiculous amount of money to make, but it looked pretty cool, so most taxpayers were fine with it. The Germans made the Führersascha, which was a long-distance flamethrower tank. British made the Triple T, which stood for the Tea Time tank, which also came with a station inside it to make tea. And Ireland made the Potato tank, which was just a glorified potato gun, to be honest. However, due to how hot the potatoes were and how fast they were shot, it could penetrate lower levels of tank armor if at the right angle. And by the time that they had developed these, the emus had reached India and were slowly moving northwards. So, NATO sent their tanks over, and thus began the Battle of India. It went on for months, a stalemate with no side gaining ground. However, on May 8th of 2026, the Dolphins launched a major naval attack on all of the supply and military boats. Using the advantage of surprise, they gathered at the sides of the ship, rocking it back and forth until it eventually sunk. This attack greatly crippled the navies of the world, and trade slowed to a halt as boats couldn't cross the ocean anymore. This lack of supplies led to the tanks on India being unsupplied, which a month later led to the tanks' army downfall. The emus destroyed the rest of India within a week or so. NATO pulled back what they had and left Russia and China to fend for themselves. As the emus began the invasion of China, NATO began trying to build a new tank army, but without boats, supplies were far harder to come across, leading tank production to be extremely slow and costly. Slow enough that a few of the European countries began working together on a secret project, ignoring the rest of the world in order to focus on it. North and South America continued their preparations for the attack as Asia took the brunt of the invasion. Now, of course, at this stage, the Americans realized how much of a threat the Emus were and decided to nuke them. However, the nuke did very little, if anything, to the emus. It dazed them, and however, other than a bit of confusion and a few scorched feathers, it had virtually no effect on them. However, just to double check if nukes were working, America also nuked France twice, and tragically, it still did nothing to the emus. I mean, the emus weren't even in France, but America was 100% sure now that the emus could survive nukes. This led the American government to do extensive research on the emus until they eventually released a document titled the Emu Eradication Papers, which was a military document explaining the emus and their weaknesses. However, honestly, it was more of a cookbook, as 75% of the document was just easy to make home recipes that included emu meat. This release caused the countries of the world to begin rearranging their armies to better combat the emus, and the citizens began rearranging their kitchens to eat the emus. However, while they were rearranging, this left them weak. The emus took advantage of this and split up. Some continued to fight in China, while the rest pushed into the Middle East. However, at this point, countries had finished their redesign, and the emus' assault came to a standstill once again. So, while the humans were focused on finding the best way to kill emus, the emus were beginning to counter these defenses with spies. They intended to sneak emus past the human defenses and gain intel. They first tried sacking 2 emus and giving them a trench coat, but aside from getting them into the theaters to watch Deadpool 3, it didn't do them much good politically. And after several other attempts, one of which involving olive oil and nitroglycerin, they finally discovered the perfect disguise: a mustache and glasses. With this, they were able to walk into places like the White House without as much as a side glance. With the ability to now commit espionage, countries began falling silently and quickly, leaving some countries now have to fight on 2 fronts, ultimately leading to their downfall as well. This led to the governments trying to catch the emu spies, basically the Red Scare Emu edition. There were a lot of mishaps due to this fear. However, the main one was the Sir Eckward III, who was the ambassador from Sealand there to discuss military tactics with the British. Citizens saw him and due to his mustache and glasses thought he was a potential emu, so they tested him to see if he was actually an emu. At the time, it was a common misconception that emus could teleport. So they loaded Sir Eckward III into a spaceship towards the sun. If he teleported back to Earth off the spaceship, then it proved that he was an emu. And so they launched the rocket. And waited. And they waited some more. And eventually they decided that he surely wasn't an emu, as an emu would have teleported back to Earth. This is when the fact occurred to them that they had no way of getting him back, and he was currently just being flown into the sun. Now, when Sealand heard about their ambassador being killed by the British, they threw a fit and said, and I quote, "You are all idiots, I hate you all so much, KYS," before Sealand simply vanished from existence. Anyways, the emus had just taken over all of Africa. The world's governments had failed to notice this happen as they were focused on catching emu spies and defending themselves, and frankly, they just didn't really care. And to make matters worse, the emus had gained traction in South America and had taken over Chile. And to make bad matters even worse, Russia had fallen. They had attempted to join the emus, but they had ended up just being taken over. Slowly but surely, humanity was losing, and despite their best efforts, there was nothing they could do. The most they could do was simply slow the emus down. South America was rapidly losing countries, with Uruguay being the only country in the southern half to stay alive. The few remaining European countries were trying to finalize their secret project, while the North American countries planned and prepared for an attack from the south. The emus, however, for the moment, focused most of their effort on South America, trying to make their way up to the US, as the Americans had managed to slow down the emus the most with their military. And eventually, they made it up to the Panama Canal, the only thing stopping them from North America. And this is where one of the most dramatic fights of the war happened. The battle officially began at 6:15 a.m. The emus began the assault by jumping over the canal to attack the trenched American and Mexican soldiers. However, the air left them easy to hit, and most of them were gunned down before they could even finish the jump. At 8 o'clock a.m., the Americans released a boat into the Panama. Now, the emus saw this as a mistake on the Americans' part, as the Dolphins had taken over the waters of the Panama months ago, so the Dolphins set to trying to sink the boat. However, none of their usual attacks worked. This was because the U.S. had built the ship out of a recently discovered material called platinum, the strongest compound metal of its time. So, as the Dolphins called for backup, the turrets on the ship activated, which had been specifically designed to kill emus, and they opened fire and began heavily reducing the number of emus. At 10 a.m., the emus had begun to keep their distance, avoiding shots from the boat. However, nearly all of the Dolphins had arrived at the Panama and were attempting to destroy and sink the boat. and they were making some concerning progress. This is when the Americans' full plan came into light. Large metal doors cut off the exits of the Panama, leaving all the dolphins trapped. At this same time, holes in the ship began dumping out Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce. That delicious sauce that goes perfectly on pork, beef, and anything else you can think of kept those dolphins from breathing by thickening the water and making it harder to swim, and covering their blowholes, causing all the gathered dolphins to suffocate, leading to one Sweet Baby Ray's American victory. Now, Sweet Baby Ray barbecue sauce isn't dangerous in the slightest if you just eat it normally. The only thing dangerous is just how good it tastes. Hashtag not sponsored. Just make sure you don't go swimming in it and you'll be fine. Ignore my swimming pool full of Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce, however, that's purely for dipping purposes. And speaking of dipping, you know what's a great thing you can dip in Sweet Baby Ray's barbecue sauce? That's right, KFC's finger looking good fried chicken. Hashtag not sponsored. When the emus eventually attack, make sure to grab their finely sized fried chicken meal to show those emus just what you think of them birds and that you aren't scared of them. And not only that, but for a limited time only, just for $15.99, you can get Kentucky Fried Emu. Once again, not sponsored. And to make that already amazing deal better, each one of those fried emus is fresh. KFC's very own Colonel Sanders is killing them single-handedly as we speak, and is sending them back to KFC restaurants to be fried and sold. This is a limited time offer, only while supplies last, not a location-bound deal. Not sponsored. The victory to this battle was almost in sight. The emu's forces had been heavily weakened, and the dolphins were almost entirely gone. But just as soldiers began to celebrate, it was revealed that the emus were one step ahead of the Americans. The emus had allied themselves with the moles and groundhogs, who had dug them a tunnel under the Panama and behind the Americans. The emus hadn't retreated because of the ship earlier. They had fallen back to begin entering the hole, and the moment they popped out behind the Americans, the massacre began. At 11 a.m., the battle was over. A crushing defeat, for the Americans had placed all their cards into the Panama. America watched helplessly as the emus overtook Mexico. But right before they reached the U.S., America made a decision. They released the Canadian geese. Now, the Canadian geese were a wild card, and a dangerous one at that. Canadian geese had almost caused human extinction numerous times throughout human history. In fact, you know the whole Adam and Eve thing with the snake tempting Eve? Well, that snake was actually a Canadian goose. It was just kind of lost in translations. So, letting the geese out of their containment in the Arctic archipelago was one of the biggest gambles in American history. And the gamble kind of worked. Canada, of course, fell rather quickly to the Canadian geese, but when the Canadian geese reached the U.S., they also reached the emus who were busy invading the U.S., leading to both the emus and geese ignoring the humans and fighting each other, allowing the U.S. to evacuate everyone who had survived to the island of Puerto Rico. Once there, the U.S. revealed that they had changed the islands to work like boats, allowing different islands to be manually controlled. Using this, they fled to the North American region and headed deeper into the ocean before pulling off their full plan, launching the entire continent of North America into space. Well, at least it was intended to go into space. As the continent began rising, the Canadian geese and emus stopped their fighting and made a truce. They began working together. The Canadian geese used their wings to try to push back against the rising continent, slowing it down. And while that was happening, the emus worked to destroy the thrusters. They managed to stop the continent a couple hundred feet in the air, causing it to come falling back towards the earth. Well, a continent falling back into the earth, of course, caused major earthquakes, but most importantly, it caused major tsunamis. These tsunamis carried the islands of Puerto Rico and crashed them into Europe, causing the end of the Americans. This left our final three countries, the only humans left in the entire world: Uruguay, Switzerland, and Britain. Uruguay survived because it was Uruguay. Switzerland, as it turns out, is incredibly powerful, which is why it always remained neutral. And Britain, well, I have no idea how Britain survived so long, but these were the three countries, and they had formulated one final plan to save humanity. And it all relied on one singular man named Steve. They had spent months preparing him, teaching him, and he'd become the best negotiator mankind had ever seen. All they hoped to do was have one conversation with the emus and figure out a way to bargain humanity to survive, even if their survival was only as slaves for the emus. And so they organized one temporary truce with the emus and sent in Steve. But this is when humanity's final plan collapsed before their eyes. They watched as Steve turned, stared them directly in their eyes, and removed a mustache and glasses, revealing that he had been one of the emu spies all along. The Emus, of course, destroyed the rest of humanity, and with the help of their new ally, the Canadian Geese, they began progressing in technology, eventually planet hopping, destroying all life, yada yada yada, destroying the universe, intergalactic wars, all of that fun stuff. I'm sure you don't care about any of that space nonsense. Either way, that was the tale of Emu War 2, Electric Boogaloo. A tale of human struggle and eventual defeat. Although the next tale is one I'd like to hear from you, and that is the tale of you hitting the subscribe button and liking the video. Does that sound too desperate? I mean, maybe I just cut the video here.